I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm here. I'm going to share 7 foundational topics that'll help you conduct better interviews. This is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to do on inclusive interviewing. So whether you are new to interviewing or you are very experienced interviewing, I think you're going to get something out of this. We're going to provide the recording and a guide with this content at the end of the webinar. And I do want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, click that notification so that you get updates on additional videos that we put out, and certainly subscribe to our our Facebook page. So have you ever had a bad interview experience and it wasn't good for you or the company that was trying to hire you? I have personally experienced that. When I got one of my first jobs in the corporate world, my interviewers failed to really evaluate me based on prior experience and my education. And as a result, I got the job, but I got the job at a level that was significantly below where I should have been. And so I know most people have probably experienced that. And if you have, put that in the chat box. I also want to encourage you to add any questions to the chat box that you have. I'll plan to answer those either at the end or during the session if it makes sense to do that. And at the webinar, I'm going to give a valuable opportunity to anybody who actually stays through this webinar so that it's going to help you in your interviewing. So let's get started. I'm Cody Horton. I'm the Managing Director for Diverse Recruiting Experts. Our company works at the top of the funnel, helping our clients find qualified, interested, and available candidates and just connecting those candidates to great opportunities. So in some places, I'm going to have slides that I'm going to share with you, and that'll help. You're also going to get the slides at the end of this. And I want to just start out with how important interviewing really is. Retention actually starts with recruiting. So if you get the recruiting right up front, you set the right expectations, you're going to have a better chance of retaining the people that you hire, and you're going to hire people at the right level. I can't stress that enough. So today, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to give you an overview of competency-based and behavior-based questions. I also am going to talk to you about hypothetical questions and when you might use them. And then I'm going to share probably the meat of this session. I'm going to touch on what's called the Sparkle and Dice listening framework. These are frameworks that allow you to actually better hear what the candidate is saying and gives you the option to probe the candidate in a way that you normally might not do if you don't have these frameworks to use. I'm also going to talk about interviews and the candidate experience, because candidates are interviewing you as a company as much as you're interviewing them. And then I want to share some information at a high level on interview bias and how you mitigate the bias. And then we're going to talk about the power of the role play and what people go through when they're in a role play. So what I wanted to do is have anyone who's there type in the chat box what you think a behavioral-based interview question, or even examples of your favorite behavior-based interview questions. I'm going to go ahead and keep an eye on the chat box. And at the same time, I want to give you the actual what a behavior-based interview question is and give you the opportunity to really kind of think through how you might apply that in your interview situations. What a behavior-based interview question is, it is a question that you're trying to get to specific situations that a candidate might have experienced in a former employment situation or in a social situation or on a project. And what you're looking for is what behaviors did the candidate demonstrate while accomplishing whatever it is they were accomplishing. It's going to give you clues to how that person behaved in that situation, and then give you the ability to maybe predict how they're going to behave in a future situation. So some people may know how you recognize these behavior questions, right? We always see them. Some of the behavior-based questions are going to start a certain way and they're going to have a certain rhythm. But let me cover, before we go into specific behavior-based questions, there are areas of focus that most employers are looking for when they're trying to assess a candidate. It might be they're trying to understand, how does this person work in a team environment? They may be looking to figure out what's this candidate's problem solving ability. This gives you a way to actually get to the initiative. What initiative have they taken and do they demonstrate? And it also lets you, evaluate the candidate on things they've done in the past that relate to their interpersonal skills, challenges, stresses, accomplishments. There are a long list of those things. So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box, and Jesus, I'll get you to help me, where people are creating behavior-based questions and putting them in the chat box. And we want to have some of those examples that you might identify. So one of the things about a behavior-based question is typically they're going to start with the words, tell me about a time, or discuss a time when, or describe a situation when. And so let's get to some specific behavior-based questions that you may want to use in an interview, or maybe you've seen them in an interview. And I'm definitely interested in getting some of your ideas on what those look like. So here's an example of a behavior-based interview question. Describe a situation where you disagreed with a supervisor. So not only are we going to teach you how to get to how to do those questions, we're also going to teach you how to listen for the answers with those questions. Some people have used models called STAR. There are other ones. I have one called Sparkle. I'll share that with you later in the presentation. Another example of a behavior-based question is, tell me about a time you had a conflict at work. They're looking for, what did you do in that situation and what behaviors did you exhibit? Other behavior-based questions that come up are, tell me about a situation where you had to solve a difficult problem. Everyone's looking for people who have done problem solving. And so this gives you a way to kind of evaluate that candidate. Another behavior-based question is, describe a project or an idea, and not necessarily your own, that was implemented primarily because of your efforts. And so that behavior-based question will let the candidate talk about what that situation was, what problem they were solving, what were they doing, what was their role in that problem, and what did they learn about it. And so I don't know if, Jesus, let me know if you see any questions in the chat box. I've got it over here so I can keep an eye on the chat box. So I had a question come in where someone says, well, should I ask hypothetical questions in my interview? And what do you think? Do you think you should ask hypotheticals in the interview? My answer is, there is a place for both behavior-based questions and hypothetical questions. And so in a behavior-based question, what you're trying to get at, you want to assess what was their experience in the past, what did they do? So they're focusing on past results. They're focusing on past learnings. You want to understand what was the performance and what was the outcome of what they were doing. And so you're also trying to find out, hey, what pattern or past behaviors has this person demonstrated in their work history? Hypothetical question is different, and it gives the candidate a chance to obviously operate in an ideal state. So when you ask a hypothetical question, for example, what would you do if a client was unhappy? What you're looking for is, you want to see what is their response to a specific situation, which may be a unique situation that you've created for that interview. The other thing you want is you are evaluating how they approach the issue, right? What was their thought process when they approached that issue? What will they be thinking about? It's not something real, but it's something on how they're going to think. And it also allows this, what I call ideal state thinking versus actual thinking. Ideal state says, in the ideal scenario, this is how I would respond to that situation. It also allows the candidate to be more creative. It gives them the opportunity to brainstorm, and it allows you as the interviewer to make adjustments to see just how far you can go with the candidate in that hypothetical situation. So what I also want to talk to you, so there you have the questions, you have the types of questions. That's one of the topics. The other thing I want you to be able to do, and this is probably one of the most important things you can do as an interviewer, whether you've been interviewing for a while or whether you're new to interviewing, you want to be prepared before your interview. So before that interview, you want to make sure that you've done some of the things that are necessary so that you can get the most out of the interview. We all have bias. We all have unconscious bias. Candidates all interview differently, and it's based on a lot of factors, right? It's based on their background, their culture, their experience, whatever the job is that they're looking for. It might be a new job, or it might be a job they've done a number of times. That doesn't keep you from preparing. So you want to be able to prep for the interview and assess all the applicants that you have on a clearly set of job requirements and competencies. So make sure that you understand the job, understand what you're looking for, and in that process, that's going to allow you to have a better interview because you've prepared for it. The other thing that you want to do is you want to take the time and actually read that job description. A lot of times you've interviewed candidates a number of times, and you kind of know the job. So that's one scenario. But sometimes you're interviewing a candidate that you don't know the job details that well. So it's important to read that job description, be really clear on what the must-haves for that job description, that job are. And then you want to do the thing that we probably all fall down on. I know I do. And that is to make sure that you read the candidate's resume. If they've sent you a LinkedIn profile, if they've sent you a resume, you want to make sure you read the resume and understand, because you can only fully understand a job seeker's answers if you know a little bit more about their background and how that background relates to the actual job you're interviewing for them. Now, resumes aren't going to get anybody the job, but the combination of a strong resume and a good interview can help you hire people that you might have missed if you were just looking at the resume or you came into the interview unprepared. And so preparation will also help you ask relevant probing questions, because you may see something on that resume that causes you to want to drill down and understand a little bit more about that candidate and their experiences. So my advice is to develop a list of job-related interview questions. Sometimes you have a structured interview, but at a minimum, you want a list of questions that you're using and you're asking every job seeker that same set of questions, or at least in the same topical areas. That's a critical thing to preparing for that interview and having the best outcome of the interview. Then the one thing, and this is probably the hardest, because we're moving at 100 miles a minute all the time. And with all the virtual lives that we have now, people tend to rush their interviews. Don't rush your interview. Avoid scheduling meetings right before or right after an interview. So that means on your calendar, put in some buffer time. Put in a little bit of time that allows you to prep for the interview and just glance over the resume again if you haven't had a chance, if you've already read it, or read the resume, read the job description, take the notes from the hiring manager or the recruiter you're working with to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what your goal is when you go into that interview. And then
Sorry to interrupt, Cody. We got a question. You mentioned the biases in the interview, and somebody asked us, how do I know if there is any, how do I know if there is bias in the interview?
Okay, yeah, I see that. That's a great question. I'm going to touch a little bit on bias. I'm going to touch a little bit on bias later, but what you should assume is everyone that's involved in that interview is going to have some bias. The candidate is going to come in with their own bias. As the interviewer, you're going to have own bias, because a lot of the bias that you're going to deal with is unconscious bias. And so that bias, you're not even aware of it, but it may be you see a certain name, right? Let's say you had the name, an interview candidate has the same name as your ex. That's going to trigger something in you. You may not even be aware of it, but that bias is going to be there. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how you recognize and mitigate that bias. And so definitely we're going to talk a little bit more detail about bias. One of the ways you're going to recognize that bias is showing up is when you say, well, I felt like, as soon as you say I felt like, or yeah, something wasn't right, or my gut or my instinct, that is filled with bias. And so bias is used to get you as quickly as you can to a decision. And normally the decision is no hire. And so I'll cover a little bit more about that. And that was a great question. And keep those questions coming in the chat box. So we talked about prepping for the interview. Well, during the interview itself, when you start the interview, make sure you start your interview on time. The candidate took the time out to come and talk to your company. And you want to be able to show them respect. And I'll talk a little bit about the candidate experience later on. But you want to start the interview on time, and you want to end the interview on time without rushing through the process. So during the interview, my tips are to build rapport with that candidate, get to know them. The trick is to not go too far in engaging in too much small talk or personal talk, which we think it's easy, but one example of causing a candidate to expose information that's not job related and could be biased and discriminatory is when you ask a candidate, where are you from? Or what is that accent? Or that's an interesting last name. Where is that from? Like those sound like normal everyday conversations, but they have no place in your interview. So one of the tips is make the candidate comfortable, build rapport, but don't have too much small talk and get too personal with the candidate. Then the other thing you want to do is that you want to make sure you let the candidate know that you're going to be asking behavior-based questions. You may let them know you're going to ask some hypothetical questions, but you just want to set the stage so the candidate understands what it is this process is going to look like. The other thing you want to do is, especially now, we're on camera. So a lot of times we've got multiple monitors. I've got a monitor over here, and I've got a monitor over here, and a monitor over here. I may have my information spread out, which I do. You may be looking at your next interview question. So you want to let the candidate know, look, I'm taking notes either by hand, so you occasionally may look down. Tell the candidate to keep answering the question. You just want them to understand what's happening so that they don't feel like, oh, they're disrespecting me. They're not paying attention to me when I'm speaking. Let them know I'm going to be taking notes. I'm going to be asking a number of questions. Don't let that bother you. Or if that does bother you, let me know. But just know I am listening and I am capturing what you said, because I want to make sure that I capture what you talked about and I don't have to rely on my memory. And one of the things that you want to do is you want to make sure that you stick to using questions that are going to draw out their behaviors, their skills, their competencies, and all the job related things, and not so much the things that may be culture fit or things like that. You're going to try to get to attributes and behaviors that you want to see and core values that you want to see in your company, but you're not trying to make this a personality competition, which is a lot of times, which is what happens early in an interview process. Perfect example. If a candidate's not laughing and smiling and having fun and doing all those things, and you're a bubbly, outgoing person, you may no hire that candidate because they didn't exhibit that they were enthusiastic. When they may be very enthusiastic and excited, they're just introverted and they're not sharing in the same form that you're accustomed to being communicated with. And then, like I said, allow 15 or 20 minutes after the interview to actually complete your interview notes, because that's going to make a huge difference in the way you remember the interview. Because I don't know about you, but I can't trust my memory. And especially if you're doing lots of hiring, which our clients are doing, they're in hyper hiring mode right now. You can't trust your memory, and candidates start to run together. So take the 15 or 20 minutes, jot your notes down, document your observation, and make that something that the candidates, that those candidates all have a fair shot because you captured the information correctly. So I'm going to pause just a second and look. I don't see any any other questions yet in the chat box, but definitely put those in there. So one of the things that I want to make sure that we know how to do, some people that are in the interview process as the interviewer aren't necessarily in the decision-making process. And so that's why your notes are important and critical. So when you're making a decision on hiring the person, you want to make sure that you capture the specific observations based on the candidate's responses to your interview. In some cases, you're going to have candidates who not only interview, but they also do something. Let's take a designer or a UX person or an architect. They may have a portfolio that you're going to look at. And that portfolio is something that's part of the decision-making process. So you want to look at the actual portfolio so you can actually give feedback on the portfolio and how it matches what you're trying to get accomplished. The other thing is to make sure you're making decisions, and I touched on this, I'm kind of beating this horse, but make sure you're not relying on your bias. My great example is the introvert extrovert thing. Oh, they didn't say enough. They didn't have enough words. When you get to Sparkle and Dice, we're going to give you a way to pull out some of the answers that you may be getting, because not every candidate is going to communicate in the same way. In the decision-making process, you want to be able to connect their responses, the candidate's responses, to the skills, to the behaviors, and to the competencies that you're looking for. You want to also look at the values that your company is looking for. And so you want to make sure that you've evaluated that candidate against your core values for the company. We have a core value in our company called Help First. And so we ask a set of behavior-based questions to get our candidates to actually talk about times when they help someone. Tell me about a time when you had to go out of your way to help someone. Or tell me about a time when you had to work with someone and pick up the slack to do work that wasn't your responsibility. So we want to understand how they approached that, what they did, and what were the results in that process. And then part of the decision-making process is you want to make sure that you have an open discussion and you listen to all the feedback. Interviewers are going to be, you're going to have the hiring manager in an interview. You're going to have peers in the interview. You're going to have other leaders in the interview. You may have someone who just got pulled into the interview. If those people took the time to be part of the interview, you want to make sure everyone's voice gets heard and you take all the feedback seriously and you discuss the feedback based on what they observed. And this is the one that sets the house on fire. Beware of hiring for culture fit. When you're hiring for culture fit, typically you're hiring for something that is not clearly defined. Every interviewer who thinks about culture fit, they're thinking about an aspect of your company's culture that they relate to. What I suggest is you reframe it and you're hiring for values, competencies, skills, and maybe how they match your core values. So we have 6 core values. One of our core values is active learner. We want examples of how has this person gone through and learned something new, or have they learned something better, or they improved their skills. Another one of our core values is diversity and inclusion from the ground up. Like, what are things that they've done in their career or in their personal lives or organizations that they belong to that actually lend to inclusion and working with other people and recognizing that there are differences in people, and how do you value those things? And the biggest thing, a lot of times when you're making a decision, a lot of conversation happens around the nice to haves. This person has all these things that are above and beyond what the job asked for. And this is probably the hardest discipline for a hiring manager or an interview team to take into consideration and to really stick to. Focus on hiring for the must-haves, not the nice-to-haves, and not the things that showed up that are connections in the interview. Perfect example. If you have someone who was the captain of the football team in your interview, and you were the captain of the football team, you're going to have a connection. If you have someone went to the same school that you went to, you're going to probably have a connection. That's your alma mater. you want to hire people from that alma mater. Or more importantly, if they're same gender, same ethnicity, same demographic, there's going to be a connection that you make that you made that has nothing to do with the job. So focus on the must-haves. What are the top priorities for that job? And does that person meet those criteria for that job? And so those are the things in the decision-making process that you want to keep in mind. And it's important to prioritize those. It goes back to the beginning. When you're prepping for the interview, make sure you're clear on what the must-haves are going to be for that job. So let me just see if there's any questions. So I see a question. I've got a question here. It says, how do you recognize if you're discriminating or stereotyping an individual during or after an interview? That's a tough one. I'm going to touch on that when we get to the bias section. And so I'll push that one out until we get to the bias section, and then I'll cover that. And then I see another question here. It says, what are the most common interview mistakes? That's a great question. I'll go ahead and address that one now. Some of the most common mistakes are, one, not being prepared for the interview, right? Interviewers just run in and they just wing the interview. They've done it a bunch of times. This usually happens with very experienced interviews. They've interviewed a bunch of times, so they don't take the time to prepare for that interview. Or they've got this favorite question that they like to ask that's a puzzle or a brain teaser or whatever question they were asking 20 years ago. They're still asking that same question. Those questions typically are not getting to what you need to get to address, does this person have the must-haves? They're typically on the fringes, and they're going to get all the nice-to-haves for that candidate. So those are some common issues. The others are forgetting that the candidate is interviewing your company as well. And so sometimes interviewers come in with a level of arrogance that doesn't work in this market. Candidates today are interviewing, and they're much more selective about who they work for. And so that's a big challenge, and that's a big issue that interviewers need to be aware of. So let me see if there's another. Okay, there are no other questions right now. So let me get into this. I want to talk about the Sparkle framework, and I think it's important for me to put this one on the screen. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, let's get this up. I'm going to share my screen. I believe I'm going to share my screen. Let me just get the right. Remember I told you about all those windows that you have open sometimes? Oh, this is one of those times. So let me get this on the right screen, because I think it's important to share this. And we will actually make sure that we get you, we're going to get you information on this. So Jesus, are you seeing the Sparkle framework on the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I want to talk about the Sparkle framework. This is a listening framework that will allows you as the interviewer to get information from a candidate. So let's say you ask a candidate, tell me about a time when you had to solve a difficult problem. What this framework does is it allows you to listen for the answer. So you want the candidate to talk about what was the situation or the story that they were in. So they're going to talk about that. You want them to talk about what problem were they solving, and then what was the action that they took to try to solve that? What were the results? What do they know now? And what were the lessons learned? And what's the evidence that what they did worked? So this Sparkle framework will allow you to ask questions in either a hypothetical way or even in a behavior-based question. This allows you to get the information that the candidate may not give you. So if they start to go on and on, this is another way to keep the candidate on track. So if they're telling you a story, but they never get to the problem they were solving, you can ask them, hey, what problem were you trying to solve? What was your action, or what was your role in solving the problem? And what were the results of the efforts that you took to solve this problem, and what do you know now? And then what are the lessons learned from the work that you did? And so I just wanted to share that. We're going to send out, we're going to give you a guide and a downloadable PDF that has this information in it, because I want to make sure that you're able to continue to move forward with this. The other thing that I want to talk to you about is the DICE framework. And I'm going to have another session where we go deeper on Sparkle and DICE, but I just want to introduce it to you today so that you're aware of it, and you can start to practice it. You don't have to have all the information to start to use these. So if we look at the DICE framework, this allows you to be able to drill down on answers. So if the candidate gives you a story, you could say, hey, can you give me more details or more data on that? Will you give me more information about the impact or who you had to influence in this process to accomplish the goal? Who did you have to communicate and collaborate with to get this work done? And did you execute that with excellence? And so with Sparkle and DICE, it's going to give you two tools that will help you get the candidate to really kind of spell out what they did. And it gives you as the interviewer the ability to probe and better understand what the candidate's situation was. So let me tell you about a few things. Let me look, see if there are any questions. Okay, we'll get back to that one. I'm going to get back to the bias question. So one of the things that I want to make sure you know about is just expect questions from the candidates. So many times interviewers go in with the intent of asking all the questions, but the candidates are asking questions too because they're interviewing you. So some of the questions that you should always be prepared for as an interviewer, and we'll get these to you, is, hey, why did you come to work here? Candidates are going to ask you that. What do you like most about working here? What would you like to change about this organization? How have you been able to manage your career here? Because people are interested in career opportunity. And then what professional developments are there in the company? And how do you like living in this area, especially if the job requires a reload? And what are the advantages and the drawbacks of working here and living here? So those are a few things that you always want to be prepared for as the interviewer that I don't think most interviewers prep for. Now, during an interview, you're always going to get stuck. People have brain freeze. So when a candidate freezes or the interviewer freezes and they just get off track and forget what they're going to talk about because there's so many distractions around, what you want to do when a candidate gets stuck is just slow down. Recognize that there's something happening with communication and just slow down. And the way you get the candidate back on track is you can ask them, hey, what was your role in the last activity that you talked about? Or what was your role in your company? Or if you saw something on a resume that looked interesting, you can ask what was their role in that. That gets the candidate freed up to talk about something they're comfortable with. You can also ask the candidate, can you repeat the last question and in a different way? Or you can get them to talk about that because you're trying to just get them unstuck and moving. You can also do what I call draw out their brilliance, right? What you want to do is you want to draw out their brilliance on topics that you already know they're comfortable with from looking at their resume or their portfolio. Get them talking about something they enjoy around the job, and that just kind of gets them unstuck and lets them move forward. And then you can ask them, one of my favorites is, tell me about something in your career that you're proud of or an accomplishment that you're proud of. Those are questions that get the candidate talking and moving forward. Then there's this component of selling the candidate. Today, more than ever, you've got to be able to sell the candidate on the opportunity. Now, a lot of time, people will want the hiring manager to do that. But I say every interviewer is responsible for selling that opportunity. And so my advice is make sure that you clearly articulate what you do in the company and why you joined the company and what keeps you in the company. And then be prepared to sell the opportunity. Make sure you're selling the company's culture and the values, sell the team that they're interviewing for, and then sell the profession. They could be job changers, career changers, and just sell the profession. If you love the profession, sell it, because you want to create an experience and give the impression that your organization is an amazing place to be. Now, if you can't do those things, you might not, maybe you shouldn't be on the interview, right? And so it's up to the people who create the interview loops and the interview teams to make sure they've got people on the interview who are actually willing to sell the candidate on the opportunity. I talk about this in the candidate experience because it's important. It impacts your employer brand. That candidate is either going to be a customer if they're not already a customer, or they're going to be a non-customer because they had a bad experience. And you want those candidates to walk away at least neutral, where they don't feel good or bad, whether they got the job or not. They're just like, hey, I had a good experience. I didn't get the job. That's okay. Or you want them to be a promoter where they say, I didn't get the job, but it was an amazing experience. If an opportunity ever comes up, I want to work for that company. What you don't want them to be is a detractor, where they're going to go to Glassdoor, Indeed, internet, any of their social channels and say, I had a terrible experience. I don't want to work at this company. I don't recommend anyone works at this company. So those are the things that you want to do to sell the candidate. And I'll give you that list. Now, when you're prepping for interviews, practice makes perfect. So there's the power of the role play. So a role play, and most people look at that. I'm going to just pop this on the screen. So the role play is really powerful, and this is why. So the next time you're asked to participate in a role play, and I'm willing to do this with anyone, is what this role play does is it builds confidence, and it allows you to actually practice and become more self-aware in a safe environment. So the role play allows you to do those things, and you just get that opportunity. It also allows you to tackle difficult issues in a very low risk environment, because typically you're role playing with people you know, they're going to give you a break. So get in there and do those role plays and practice those. Even if you do it with your family or your friends, that's a good place to start a role play. They're also going to let you explore alternate solutions. So you may, if you do something wrong in a role play, there's no implication. There's no risk there. So it gives you an opportunity to explore things that you might otherwise not be able to do. And then it's going to give you the ability to improve your communication skills, because the key is to get feedback. And when you get feedback, it's going to help you get better at answering questions, at doing the role play. So when you actually get in the game and you're in a real interview, you've already seen this before and you've already got the reps to be better. Role play is also engaging and interactive. I talked about practice. And the other powerful thing about a role play is you have the ability to observe someone else and learn from their mistakes or pick up on some of the things that they do really well. And so get that real-time feedback. I say record your role plays and watch yourself and talk to others about what you did well, what you didn't do well. And so there's a lot of power in the role play that we miss a lot of times. And so I just wanted to make sure that I shared those things around the role play. So now let me just check to see if there are any other questions. I don't see anything. So let me get to these bias questions. There are a couple of questions on bias. One of the things about bias, and I'm going to talk about unconscious bias. The bias is a shortcut. Your mind says something's not right, and the bias kicks in, and it's a shortcut to get you back to a place of safety. So you're going to have a fight or flight response to many things. Some bias is leaning you toward things that you're afraid of, and some bias is leaning you toward things you enjoy and you appreciate. Either way, it's going to be a shortcut to get you to make a decision that, oh, I really like this person because they went to my school, they have the same degree. Oh, I don't like that person because they have the same name as my ex, and you're just not trying to go there. And so some of the things that you want to avoid is here's a way that you can tell there's bias. If someone says with a candidate, I can't really put my finger on it, but it's just a gut feeling. Or I don't think they're a culture fit. That's the house set on fire point. Or something didn't feel right. So someone said, how do I recognize bias? You hear things like that. Or you hear a different tone, you hear a different accent, you hear a different cadence in the way people speak. You might see someone walk in that's visual. They've got crazy hair, they've got tattoos, they've got all kinds of other things that are happening in their world that have nothing to do with the job, but your bias kicks in because you're not accustomed to it, or they've got a name that you can't pronounce, or something like that. They're a different race, they're a different gender, they've got disability, they've got something happening in their own culture. There's a body type issue that happens. And there's a whole list of biases that we do a workshop on where we talk about unconscious bias and how you mitigate it. So those are some of the things around bias. And I want to give you real quick how you mitigate the bias when you see it, know it's happening. First thing is to recognize your own bias. So when you hear those words go off in your head, you know, wow, there's something happening that my bias may be kicking in. And so recognize that bias. Then you want to be aware as you get more and more aware of what are the triggers that are likely to cause that bias to show up. One of the ways to mitigate it is just slow down, take a step back, take a breath, pause, and consider your bias before you respond. I always tell people, get a drink of water, take a deep breath. The whole goal here is you're trying to slow yourself down. Then you might want to do one thing differently, like ask the candidate for feedback. Hey, how is it going so far for you? That shifts you out of that state of mind, and you're doing a state change because you're getting ready to listen versus drill in on the bias that you were doing. And then probe for more information, right? If a bias says, well, this person, they're not good communicators, and you're an extroverted person, when you probe for more information, that's going to give you the opportunity to address that bias and then just slow it down. So the main thing to deal with when you're mitigating bias is just slow down, recognize that bias, and change your state. That's going to be helpful. In the other courses, the workshops that we're going to do, we'll cover this in more specifics for each kind of bias that's out there. And there's so many, so we're not going to cover them all. But I recommend that you keep an eye out for a future webinar where we're going to go over the bias a lot more. And so let me just look at questions. I know we're already at time. I want to just see if there are any other questions, Jesus, that are in the chat, or any questions that come in, just so we make sure that we cover anything with the group.
We are missing two questions. What are the most common interview mistakes? And the last one that say, what can you share about interviewing on video?
Yeah, one of the things that I talked a little bit about common interview mistakes, not prepping for the interview, common interview mistake, assuming things that you know, not asking enough questions, not probing the candidate. Those are some of the big mistakes. Or, you know, being biased toward a person who went to a school that you went to, or you don't like their name, or you don't like their degree, or whatever that is. Those are some big issues that show up. And then what was the other question? Oh, video. So for video, you want to make sure you have well lit, and I'm going to do a whole session on video interviews and virtual interviews, but you want good lighting, test your equipment, make sure your mic is working, make sure your camera is working, make sure you're prepared, make sure you realize that, hey, even if I'm just talking into a camera, someone, whether it's recorded or live, you want to make sure that you are talking to a person and not just a piece of equipment. And so just keep it real, as in it's communication back and forth. And we're going to do a whole session on video and virtual interviews. And so that is one of the things that I think is so critical in this market. So I want to thank everybody for sticking around. We're going to give away a free interview coaching session with me for the people who stuck around for this session and to spend time and do one-on-one coaching with you and just help you get on the right track. The other thing that we're going to do is we are building an inclusive interviewing workshop that's going to be online and on demand. And I want to make sure that we give each person who stuck around free access to that once it goes live. Once we release that workshop, we'll send you an email and let you register at no charge for that. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate you joining me. Look forward to having you on the next session. Like our Facebook page, click the subscribe and click the bell notification, and we'll see you soon. Jesus, I'll take one more question if there are any, but other than that, Hope everyone has a great rest of your week.
We are done. Thank you very much, Cody.